Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me to this conference. I'm very honored to be here, and thanks for being here that early. So I'm going to talk about a paper where I developed a model of endogenous leverage and interest rates in collateralized bonds among competitive investors with heterogeneous beliefs. So for those who are familiar with this literature, when you think of endogenous leverage and heterogeneous beliefs, you may think of Giannakopoulos and subsequent papers. But in those papers, there's only one leverage ratio. And the reason is different across papers. It's coming either from a simplifying assumption on the underlying structure of belief or the number of agents. So of course, even for a particular asset, there's many different leverage ratios in the economy. So what I'm just doing in this paper is to relax this hypothesis that leads to just one leverage ratio and see what happens and see whether that's interesting. Hopefully it is. So the first prediction when you do that is that when disagreement goes to zero, that is you go to the benchmark where everyone has the same beliefs, the upper tail of the distribution of leverage ratios goes to a Pareto distribution with an endogenous tail coefficient equal to 2 for any smooth and bounded away from zero density of beliefs. So, and that's potentially interesting because if you look at the data, it seems that there is this Pareto distribution for leverage ratios. So this is the cumulative, the log survivor function. So that means the log counter cumulative distribution function for hedge funds, for the cross-section of hedge funds, as a function of the log leverage ratio. So that's the probability that the leverage ratio of a hedge fund is higher than a certain number. And under the hypothesis that this is a Pareto distribution, you should see a straight line, which seems to be the case to a good approximation. And the coefficient that you find is indeed -2, which points to a Pareto distribution of coefficient 2. Yes?
When you're thinking of these differences in beliefs, if you look at these hedge funds,
they're doing different things.
They could be very different in what they
So
do.
you can look at that across asset classes. So unfortunately, I don't know exactly what they do, but you can bin them by classes of hedge fund depending on what you do, and you will find the same thing. Now, of course, I mean, across hedge funds, so maybe a better example is one of a homeowner, okay, of houses in the US. So that's the cross-section of the leverage ratio on new loans in the US, okay, for a particular time, which is here it's August 2010. So there's a huge impact of regulation here. But apart from that, it's quite well approximated by a Pareto distribution, and this is more generally true for entrepreneurs in the survey of consumer finance and for firms in Compustat. Because of this Pareto distribution that you generate on leverage ratios, you will get exposed Pareto distribution for realized return, regardless of the underlying amount of disagreement between agents. And we know, for example, that the returns to entrepreneurship are very skewed and fat tail, and so that's a way in which you create such an heterogeneity. And there's a second prediction of the model, which is the distribution of interest rates will adjust so that borrowers and lenders will be matched assortatively, and the interest rates on bonds will be assignment prices that are disconnected from true and expected default probability. So in particular, so what I'm going to have is an assignment model where everyone thinks that the bonds they're investing in are completely safe. And even though they are completely safe because of this assignment mechanism, you're going to have interest rates that are higher than the risk-free rates. And so that's potentially a new determinant for the pricing of fixed income securities. So that's potentially interesting because in finance we know that there's a lot of things we don't understand about the prices of these securities. Also because investing in high yield, if you see banks that go for supposedly risky bonds that not necessarily the sign of risk shifting, it could be that they think that these bonds are not going to default at all. And also because there's going to be this matching between borrowers and lenders, the market is going to be very fragmented. Everyone will borrow with a different leverage ratio, with a different interest rates, and that's potentially interesting because we know empirically that a lot of these markets that are used to express disagreement are indeed OTC markets. So the model's ingredients is going to be a Geornak-Koplos model where I'm just going to assume that there's disagreement on mean rather than default probability. So let me take you through this. So basically, the reason why there's just one leverage ratio in Geornak-Koplos is that he assumes that everyone agrees on the value of the collateral conditional on default. So conditional on there being a bad state, something bad happening. What I'm just doing is to say that maybe people disagree on that too, and the amount that they will agree to lend will be dependent on what they think is this bad state. So the key results, as I said, is the Pareto distributions for leverage ratios and expected and realized return, which also, as I'm going to show you, gives information on the representativeness of the marginal buyers and on elements of the belief distribution. And I'm going to see spreads as hedonic interest rates, which is potentially interesting for the pricing of securities. And also because the model is very simple, I'm going to be able to do some things that are not possible to do in Geornak-Koplos, so to have multiple layers of lending, that is to use the loans themselves as collateral to get more funds. And we know that during the crisis, it was a key element of the financing of housing. And also, I'm able to treat endogenous short sales. So even though there's going to be no restriction on short selling in this extension, you're going to have endogenous rebate rates that look like transaction costs. But in fact, they're just going to come from disagreement and from a competitive mechanism and a pricing mechanism. There's going to be an endogenous short interest too. So there's a lot of literature, but because I don't have a lot of time, let me go through the model right away. So the plan of the talk is to first do the most simple model where you only have borrowing contracts. This you only allow the risky asset to be used as collateral. You don't allow the loans themselves to be used as collateral, and you don't allow for short sales. There's two extensions, one when you can use the loans as collateral, and there's a second one where you can do short sales. But first, this one is going to give me the Pareto distributions and the interest rates that are higher than the risk-free rate, even though they're safe. Okay, so there's two periods, 0 and 1, and there's a continuum of agents of measure 1, and they're born with wealth 1. Okay, I've normalized everything to 1. They consume in period 1, so they need to transfer their wealth. Okay. There are three ways they can do that. There's the first way, which is a storage technology that I refer to as cash, which is the safe technology, the non-disagreement technology, if you will, whose return is normalized to 1. And there's a real asset in finite supply, which is also normalized to 1 with an exogenous price in period 1, and people will form beliefs about this price. And depending on the beliefs people have about this future price, there's going to be an endogenous price of the asset in period 0, which I denote by P. There's borrowing contracts collateralized by the real assets, and they're no recourse loan. And I make the normalization that there's 1 unit of real asset in collateral for each one of the borrowing contracts I'm going to talk about. And phi is the key element in this paper. So that's the face value of the loan, which gives you, so for 1 unit of collateral, which gives you an idea of leverage. Okay? Phi is the number of units of consumption you promise to repay in period 1 if you have 1 unit of borrowing contract. The notation for this contract is phi into brackets. And implicitly, there's 1 unit. Remember, always there's 1 unit of risky asset in collateral. And they're traded in competitive markets that are anonymous at price Q of phi. And Q of phi is the loan amount. Okay? So that's how much you get in period 0 for promising to repay phi in period 1. So the interest rates on this loan is phi over Q of phi. Okay? And the payoff of the loan is the minimum of phi and P1. So if the price, say you're using housing as collateral, if the price of housing is lower than the amount that you promise to repay, you default and the lender gets the collateral, so he gets P1. Okay? Yes?
Clarifying question. You said everybody has wealth 1. I mean, who holds the real asset initially?
So initially, risky asset is owned by people who are outside of the model. So think of OLG. Think of an OLG framework, and the old sell their assets. Okay, so the agents, they agree to disagree on P1, okay? And I'm going to make in this presentation a simplifying assumption, which is that people are sure what is going to happen tomorrow. So they have point expectations about what the future price of this asset is going to be tomorrow. So that's the key difference with Giannac approach, where agents agree on the value of the collateral upon default, and they disagree on the relative probabilities of different states. But you can actually generalize this where agents agree on the probability distribution of states around this mean, and they are risk neutral. Okay, but for simplicity, it's easier to think that people think they know what is going to happen tomorrow. So there's a density little f, okay, of these beliefs, and with cumulative distribution big F. And that's exogenously given. There's no learning. That's agree to disagree, and that's okay. So given the price of the asset in period 0 and the price of each one of these bonds with different face values, and in equilibrium, there's going to be a lot of these different bonds that are going to be traded, the agent I, with his beliefs, P1I, chooses his portfolio in the risky asset NAI in each one of the bonds with different riskiness, and in cash to maximize his expected wealth in period 1 under its budget constraint, the collateral constraint. So basically, if he has NAI units of risky asset, it's going to give him, according to his expectation, P1I in period 1. And if he buys NBI units as a lender, he's going to get the minimum of phi and P1I. And the returns to cash is normalized to 1. And he has to be able to afford this bundle. So remember, he has a unit wealth. The price of the asset is P. The price of each one of the bonds is Q of phi. And again, the price of cash is 1. And he has to be able to collateralize these promises. So that's the collateral constraint. That is, you, as a borrower, you cannot go more negative in the borrowing contracts as the number of assets you're buying in equilibrium. If you have one house, you can only use one house as collateral at most. Okay, and here, for simplicity, I'm ruling out short sales, so these things have to be positive. Okay, so the definition of an equilibrium is just a price system and portfolios for each agent, such that agents maximize and markets clear. Markets clear, so the market for the risky asset, there's just one unit of this risky asset, and all of the bonds with different face value are financial contracts, so they are in zero net supply. Okay, so the solution of this equilibrium is as follows. So depending on their optimism, agents are going to split into 3 types. Okay, so there's going to be a large class of people who are borrowers. They are the most optimistic. Okay, so they buy the asset and they use the asset as collateral to get more funds and to buy more of them. And you can think of them as homeowner, hedge funds, or entrepreneurs in the examples I showed you previously. Okay, so there's a second class, big class of agents, which are going to be lenders. You can think of them as banks or money market funds. And there's the cash investors, okay? So let me take you through what the borrowers are doing. So the borrowers, if they have beliefs P1I, they're going to maximize over this quantity. Okay, so so let me take you through this expression. So in equilibrium, the collateral constraint has to bind. Why is it? Because the borrower think they're going to make excess returns on the bond, on the asset. They think it's cheap, so they're relatively optimistic. So they will use every one of these units of houses that they buy to get more funds. So the collateral constraint binds. So now, how do you finance an asset whose price is P? Well, you issue a borrowing contract, and you get Q of phi from the lender, and you just have to finance P minus Q of phi with your own funds. So the number of real assets that you can buy or of borrowing contracts that you're using is 1 over P minus Q of phi, okay? So that's the leverage ratio is P over P minus Q of phi. It's asset over equity, okay? So this is the expected return of a borrower, because that's the number of units of asset that he's buying. That's for each unit of asset how much he's getting, and that's how much he expects to repay to the lender in the next period. So he's maximizing over this quantity. So I don't have time to show you too many equations, but let me tell you what happens. So it has to be, so in equilibrium, all of the borrowers, because they're risk neutral, they all want to borrow ideally with the highest leverage ratio. Okay, they think they're going to make excess returns, so they really want to leverage themselves. The problem is that they're borrowing from people who are not necessarily so optimistic, so there's only a limited amount of high leverage ratio contracts that corresponds to the optimistic lenders. So in equilibrium, it has to be that the interest rates on high leverage ratio loans are going to rise, not because of expected default probabilities, but in order to assign borrowers to lenders. Yes?
Isn't this kind of depend on the fact that you have this, they're risk neutral, they have differences in beliefs. Like usually you can set it up very similarly if they have differences in, say, risk tolerance. But in that case, it wouldn't seem to get such that kind of a sharp result. Because then they would take different amounts of leverage, but they could do it.
No, that's true.
By spreading out the leverage among any kinds of things.
No, you're right. So I think this is really an extreme. I'm not saying this is the world. I think this is an extreme model. But I would suspect that the forces I'm going to show are going to survive in a more complicated model. This qualitative insight that you can get interest rates that are disconnected from default probabilities that come from assignment, I think is going to survive in a more rich model. And there's surely going to be some trade-off in between those two. Here is very stark, but it also makes it more easy to understand, I think. So you're going to have a trade-off between return on the bond and leverage. Okay, so the leverage ratio on the return on high leverage ratio loans is going to rise so that market clears for the high leverage ratio loans. Okay, so what happens in equilibrium is that it has to be that when the promise phi increases, you get more funds now, because otherwise you would never use those contracts. So Q of phi is increasing. So the leverage ratio, which is P over P minus Q of phi, is also increasing in phi. Okay, so leverage rises with the face value. And there's a trade-off between a higher leverage and a higher interest rate. Okay, so let me show you that the lenders, their problem is very simple. So they choose the face value of the loan they use as the face value is going to be equal to their beliefs. If I believe that the price of housing is going to be 90 for sure in the future, that I will lend 90. Okay, this is very intuitive. So why don't they use a higher phi? Well, that's because for them, if you choose a too risky contract, then it will default for sure. And because they will have to pay more today, they will never choose this contract. And now because, as I said, the interest rates are rising in leverage, they're going to choose the highest return bond consistent with them thinking it's not going to default. Okay, so they will choose exactly the contract that corresponds to their beliefs. And so, as I said, leverage rises with the face value, and the face value is equal to the belief of lender who trade these contracts. So leverage rises with the beliefs of lender, which is sort of intuitive, okay? And lenders, what is important is that they think they trade perfectly safe contracts. Okay, so the reason why there's a higher return on this contract is not that they expect them to default. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is that there's actually supermodularity of expected wealth of a borrower with respect to his beliefs and the face value of the loan. So there's going to be sorting in equilibrium between the most optimistic lenders and the most optimistic borrowers. Okay, so I'm not taking you through the equations, but this is actually intuitive. So if you're more optimistic, you like more buying more units of the assets. Okay, so you would agree to pay more to get a higher leverage ratio. And so in equilibrium, that's what the competitive equilibrium leads you to, and that's mathematically that's coming from this cross derivative that is positive. Okay, so there's positive sorting between borrowers and lenders. The most optimistic. So remember that people choose not people but contracts. But it happens that on the other side of the trade, there is someone who is effectively lending to them. Yes?
I'm trying to map this into a problem I'm sort of more familiar with. So Could you map this into a situation where and there's a leverage constraint, so some investors are leverage constraint, and assets to have a different amount of risk, so that in that situation, people want to take a lot of risk but gravitate towards the assets that have more risk because they can't just lever up the assets that are safer to get equivalent risk.
Okay.
So is that like similar to replacing the different lenders who have different beliefs with different assets that have different levels of risk?
So in that case, so you would multiply. So you say you would buy a high beta stock.
It's a bit like the embedded leverage
Yeah,
situation.
it would
Some
be embedded.
assets give you more embedded leverage.
Yes. So I think you can. So I mean I don't want to overinterpret and to say that this is extremely general. But I think that there is this flavor, and
It's interesting. I'm just trying to. It's kind of like the setup is different in that sense.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand. And we could have both. I'm just trying to understand like in what ways they're similar.
so, but in your example, you have sorting too. I mean, you know this.
I mean, sorting based on asset type. So
Yeah.
the really optimistic or low risk aversion types gravitate toward.
Okay, but I think the interesting thing with having ex ante people who are homogeneous, you're not assuming that there's someone who's a lender, someone who's a borrower, is that some of the key results to the one of the Pareto distribution are going to come from the fact that you choose to be a borrower and a lender endogenously. And here, so these predictions would not survive in your model because you're taking leverage as given. Here, the fact that the leverage endogenous is important. I'm going to show you these results. The belief of the borrower to the belief of a lender is matched through the matching function gamma. Okay, so, and because of this sorting, there's gamma prime, that's positive. Okay, so there's two differential equations on this problem that come, so the first one comes from the fact that when borrowers choose their optimal contract, they indeed have to be matched to the right lender through this contract, such that there's indeed this sorting through function gamma. So it has to be that gamma solves this problem, that gamma of y, which is the belief of the lender borrower with belief y is matched with, gamma of y has to be the solution to this problem. Okay, that gives you a first differential equation on the problem. There's a second differential equation that comes from the market clearing of the financial contracts, and that say that the wealth of borrowers has to be equal to the wealth of lenders, and you progressively go into more and more pessimistic lenders as you have market clearing. Okay, so if you count the number of unknowns and of equations that you have two functions to solve for. There's the Q function, or the interest rate function, if you will. There's the matching function. There's the three numbers, Xi, P, and tau, that separate cash investors and lenders and borrowers, and the price of the assets. So the indifference between cash and lending here is saying that the interest rates on the lowest leverage ratio loan have to be equal to 0. Okay? It has to be that people here are indifferent between cash and lending. There's indifference between lending and investing here. So if you're a lender with the highest leverage ratio, R of tau, that's the return you get, it has to be equal to the levered return that you get as a borrower if you have belief tau. Okay? The most pessimistic lenders are matched to the most pessimistic borrowers, and the most optimistic lenders are matched to most optimistic borrowers, and then there's market clearing for the real assets. So in equilibrium, all of the funds, both of the lenders and the borrowers, effectively are invested in the assets, so the price is equal to 1 minus f of psi. Okay? Okay, so those are all the equations you need to solve for the equilibrium, and let me show you what it looks like. So for concreteness, I'm going to show you what happens when you have a uniform distribution of beliefs. Okay? In that case, the model is very simple because you can solve it in closed form for everything. In particular, you have two first-order ordinary differential equations. You're getting a nonlinear second-order differential equation, but you're lucky that it has a closed form solution. So you can look at everything in the model is endogenously expressed as a function of the parameters. Of course, it doesn't look good, so the price of the asset, for example, as a function of disagreement is that, but you can play with it and see what happens. So the thing is that regardless of the underlying distribution of beliefs, as long as it's bounded away from zero for the most optimistic people, this Taylor expansion of the price of the asset is going to be true. And that's all you need to prove the properties I will show you about the Pareto distributions in particular. So again, for concreteness, I'm going to show you what happens for another distribution of beliefs to show you it doesn't depend on it, which is going to be an increasing distribution of beliefs like this. Okay? Okay, so what happens is that this is the fraction of people who are lenders, cash investors, and borrowers as a function of disagreement. So when disagreement goes to zero, you have the leverage of borrowers, which becomes very large. And the reason is that lenders are not too worried that the borrowers will default, so they lend them almost all of the amount that they need to invest in the asset. So the less disagreement in this model, the more leverage you have. Okay, it seems that you have a discontinuity at the benchmark in a sense. Okay, what you get by continuity when you go to zero is not a case where everyone invests in the same way in financial market, but it's one in which people have very heterogeneous positions. Okay, so the second result of the model is the fact that you get this Pareto distribution for leverage ratios of borrowers, okay, regardless of the underlying distribution of beliefs. So let me give you an intuition for why it doesn't depend on the underlying distribution of beliefs. So this model transforms a bounded support distribution of beliefs into an unbounded support distribution of leverage ratios. As I said, the most optimistic lender is almost the marginal buyer of the assets. Okay, and here it's important that becoming a borrower or lender is endogenous. Okay, so the guy who's just indifferent between lending and investing in the assets thinks that the price of the asset is almost right. So he agrees to lend with a very high leverage ratio. And to the limit, this actually goes to infinity. Okay? So you see that you're transforming a bounded distribution into an unbounded distribution. And the unbounded part comes from a very small part of the distribution in the end. And so you can approximate this part by a uniform distribution to a first approximation. And for the uniform, it gives you exactly the Pareto of coefficient 2. Okay, so that's why what you have in the upper tail doesn't depend on the underlying distribution of beliefs that you have. Okay, okay, so this is the distribution of leverage ratios that you get as a function of disagreement. So you see that leverage ratio always becomes very high, okay, for some borrowers, but that as you decrease leverage, the whole distribution actually shifts to the right. And so if you observe in the data this distribution of leverage ratio, you can actually estimate what is the underlying distribution, what is the underlying level of disagreement that is consistent with the model. Okay? So that's what you obtain if you have just increasing distribution of beliefs. Okay, so instead of your uniform, you have the increasing. You see that what changes is the lowest part of the distribution, but that, as I said, the upper tail, because you can approximate it by a uniform distribution, stays a Pareto of coefficient 2. Okay, so you can estimate the level of disagreement that is consistent depending on how far out this distribution is. You can estimate the amount of disagreement that is consistent with the model. Okay, that's for hedge funds. So you can do it when it's not bounded away from zero. In this case, you will get a Pareto coefficient which is 2 plus rho, if rho is the coefficient on the Taylor expansion of the belief distribution. But what's important is that the scale independence remains, and that also you get returns, both expected and realized returns, which are a Pareto distribution because from an envelope condition. So basically, the derivative of the return function is just the leverage ratio itself. Since the leverage ratio is Pareto distributed, the returns are also going to be Pareto distributed, okay? Okay, so, and you have the interest rates, okay, depending on again, on level of disagreement, you can get hedonic spreads, as I said, that come from the fact that people have to be matched assortatively in equilibrium, and that again are disconnected from expected default probabilities that are substantial depending on the level of disagreement that you observe. Okay, and in particular, exposed, what you get also is a non-monotonic relationship between leverage and returns, depending on the actual realized returns of borrowers, because actually, even if you're right that, say, housing prices were going up, if you were too optimistic, you were paying too high an interest rate to lender, okay, to go into leverage, and so actually you make lower return than someone who was exactly right about what was the future course. So you have a non-monotonic relationship between leverage and returns. Yes?
When you say that these interest rates are disconnected from expected default probability, I mean, maybe this is like a semantic point, but
yeah.
It's still kind of expected default probabilities that drive the assignment, right? Because the lender who lends to a certain borrower would not want to lend to a borrower with a higher leverage ratio because he would expect that borrower to default.
Yeah. No, when I say that, I mean in the sense that the bond that he's trading, he doesn't expect it to default.
That's specific lender, but some other, I mean, in some sense, I mean, that's another question I have. If you say the realized return,
yeah.
I mean, so your assignment, you don't really need to take a stance on what the true belief is, right? But then for the realized return...
So exposed, you can look at what happens. It can be that actually these loans actually default. So it can be that those rates are actually justified by the amount of default you have exposed. But the reason why you have these spreads ex ante is not risk aversion. Okay, it's not so. When you load, for example, the spread between BAN and AAA, you will load it on disagreement rather than on risk aversion, for example. Okay. Okay. So let me go into the two extensions that I wanted to look at. Yeah.
So what about the market shares of different guys in the assets?
In the assets.
Because we were all starting with the same wealth, then it just.
So here it translates into it translates into the size of the investments of these guys, which is also going to be some Pareto distribution because of this leverage ratio. So it's the distribution of assets is also Pareto with the same distribution. Of course, in practice, I mean, you have large hedge funds, small hedge funds. So you have to multiply the leverage ratio by the size of the equity that they had initially.
And suppose we started people with a size, like a distribution of wealth. So there's sort of a heterogeneity in initial wealth also.
Yes, so you could subsume this heterogeneity in initial wealth in the F function. So if you want the F function, which is giving you the distribution of beliefs, is subsuming both how optimistic people are and how wealthy they are. Okay, you would just say, okay, you can reinterpret each unit of the equity as someone on this distribution F, and then you just say someone who has more equity is someone who's just, you just say as if it was many people.
So that could be one version of it where the only difference
is wealth.
And that would have very sharp predictions also on the market share. So you could look at the hedge funds for
yes, it would.
See whether the guys in the tails are the big guys.
Yes, it would. Exactly. Yes, it would. Yes. Yeah.
As the disagreement decreases, the fraction of borrowers, like on total population.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. So all the asset holdings,
because they are very leveraged,
are actually concentrated among.
Yeah. So you have few hedge funds that are very leveraged.
So the Pareto distribution is still preserved, but among less and less people.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You're looking. So when I say Pareto distribution, it's conditional on being a borrower, and the fraction of this borrower is actually shrinking itself. Okay. So there's some measure in which this is actually continuous. But if you look at the distribution of borrowers, it's not continuous. Okay. So depending on what you look at, you're looking at something that that is of measure 0 or decreasing vanishing measure, but that still has this Pareto distribution.
So like going back to Valentin's question, if you actually wanted to like calibrate these parameters, the amount of disagreement to what you observe, you have this trade-off between like how to get the shape right versus the relative share of these borrowers in the economy.
So if you trust the model, it should match. I mean, it should match the two numbers as well. Of course, I mean, we don't observe all of the amounts of repo transactions that these hedge funds are doing. I mean, what is exactly, and as you'll see, I mean, when you have some pyramiding lending arrangements, things become a lot more complicated. So it's, I mean, I think it's easier to identify the amount of disagreement with the leverage ratio distribution. But you're right that if you believe the model, it should also match the measure of borrower well. Okay, so now I allow the borrowing contracts to be used as collateral themselves, okay? Because for now, I've assumed that you cannot use these contracts, these loans, as collateral to get more funds. Of course, I mean, during the crisis, you know, I mean, before the crisis, it was the case that those loans were actually securitized and used to get more funds from money market funds and so on. So I'm allowing here for lenders of type 2, which are people who lend against the loan as collateral. And actually, this appears very naturally in this model because of these hedonic interest rates that the lenders are earning. They want to leverage into them. Okay, if they can, they want to use these loans and to leverage as much as they can into these loans in order to make higher expected returns. Okay, and so of course there's a lot of examples of that, which is, for example, loans to small and medium enterprises are securitized, or rehypothecation of collateral is also an interpretation in which you use the same collateral multiple times to back multiple promises. Okay. And what I show is that the price then increases even more. So the price was already reflecting much more the opinion of the optimists, but in that case, when you allow for those pyramiding lending arrangements, they are non-redundant to what was happening before that, even though, in fact, the face value of the loans can be face values that you had access to before, but because the collateral was not used efficiently, and you could not use the collateral multiple times, you could not actually have these loans in equilibrium. Here you can, so you're getting more funds that are being channeled to this risky asset. Okay, and so you can think, in fact, of these arrangements also as trenching. Okay, it's actually equivalent to trenching. So what happens is that the price of the asset is financed both by a lender of type 1, who is financing Q1 of phi of this amount, and the P minus Q1, and this Q1 itself is financed by a lender of type 2 to an amount Q2 of phi prime. Okay, and so the lender has to finance by himself only Q1 of phi minus Q2 of phi prime. And so it's as if the lender of type 1 was getting money in the states, in the intermediary states, and as if the lender of type 2 was getting money only if the state is bad. Okay, so it has the same payoffs, the same ex post payoffs as trenching. Okay, so in that case, what I show is that the Pareto coefficients that you get on the leverage ratio distribution decreases. And in particular, I show that if you have L levels of this pyramiding lending arrangements, the coefficient is going to be L plus 1 divided by L. So remember, previously I had just one layer of lending, and so L was equal to 1, so that was equal to 2. But then as you increase the number of levels, you have this Pareto coefficient that decreases more and more, and that actually goes to 1. Okay, remember, so in the borrowing economy, you have a coefficient 2, and here you have a coefficient that's slightly lower when you have 2 levels. So then, as you go to the crisis, so unfortunately I don't have the video to show you what happened before, but so I have the universe of new loans as a function of time, and you can look at the fact that in fact leading up to the crisis, while this coefficient was roughly stable until 2000. Leading up to the crisis, indeed, you had a decrease in the Pareto coefficient. And so from the model, you would say, even though if you don't want to take a stand on who's right and who's wrong, you would say, well, it looks like the optimist is pricing more and more these assets, okay? Okay, so what you also get with this extension with pyramiding is that the model is telling you that the borrowers have higher and higher expected returns. Okay, so here you take the same amount of disagreement and you look at what happens when you allow for these loans to be used as collateral themselves. You see that the expected returns of borrowers are actually increasing a lot, okay, compared to the case where you have just one layer. And so, of course, unfortunately, I don't have risk aversion in this model, but there's a flavor of people seeming to take more risk, okay, because their expected returns are higher. Unfortunately, I don't have risk aversion, so I'm not sure I can really say that.
Just a clarifying question about like the values for the housing, for the hedge funds. So
Yeah.
when you compute the hedge funds, are you controlling for the assets hedge funds? So are you comparing only hedge funds that are holding the same assets or not?
Yes, yes. So you can look for so you have multiple types of hedge funds, long, short equity. You can look within a class, and you still find the same distribution. Exactly.
So
Yes.
for example, for housing, you could look at some geographic areas, for example, because
Exactly, and you could estimate depending, for example, on how much the supply is elastic or not, whether people have different beliefs or the history of housing prices, whether they seem to update more. I mean, those are things that you can look at. Here, I show you the universe of all, but yeah. So, okay, so there's a second thing that you can do with this model because it's so simple, which is short sales, okay? So you can allow for short sales. And so the reason why previously short sales were not present in disagreement model is that it's actually hard to understand why people choose to lend rather than short, okay? So if short selling is an option, and if you're relatively pessimistic, you're a natural short seller of the asset. So why would you lend to someone rather than sell short? Okay, so what I do is that I do the model in the case where you have short selling that is available. And what you get is that the most optimistic are still borrowers. Then the not so optimistic are lending to short sellers. Okay, so the securities lenders. So effectively they're investing in the security, but they're lending these securities to short sellers. Okay, the lenders are lending to borrowers and the short sellers are shorting the assets. Okay, so what I show is that in that case, the price is actually reflecting the opinion of the pessimists. In that case, it's not an even price, but it's not the average price, the average beliefs, but it's the opinion of the pessimists. I also have endogenous rebate rates that appear, and that come from two reasons. So maybe the second one is easier to understand. So one reason why you have endogenous rebate rates is again this assignment that some short sellers really want to sell short the assets. They're really pessimistic. And so because of these assignment prices, they have to pay more in order to be able to sell short. And so one of the reasons why you see some cost of short selling in this model is again to have market clearing. Something that's interesting is that you also get that the returns on the lowest leverage ratio bonds are going to be higher than the risk-free rates because they need to compensate the lenders for not short selling. Okay, so it needs to be, if you're a borrower, you need to give a return to your lender such that he doesn't want to sell short. So you're going to have to give him a higher return. Okay, so all of these are predictions of the model. So let me show you three things. So the fact that the price you see, which is in this black line, is reflecting more and more the opinion of the pessimists. You see that in equilibrium, it doesn't seem like you have a lot of short sellers in equilibrium. Okay, the fraction of short sellers is going to zero, just as the fraction of the borrowers is going to zero. So it's not because you don't observe short selling in equilibrium that there are short sales constraints or anything. Yes?
What's keeping the supply of of the asset available for borrowing constraint?
So I'm not assuming, so it's in equilibrium that people will not use all of the assets. So let me show you maybe what you're asking for, which is a short interest. And short interest is an endogenous object in this model. And so the reason why not all units are used on loan is that the borrowers also really want to borrow from the lenders. So they give them returns so that they don't short instead. And so in equilibrium, it happens that so the reason why not everyone is short selling is that the borrowers, they're really optimistic. They want to borrow from someone, and they need to borrow from someone who doesn't use his equity to short sell. And so he needs to convince lenders to lend to him, and for that he gives them a return. And so in equilibrium, the prices are such that there's not so much short selling in equilibrium. Okay, so maybe we can discuss. I mean, usually the models that so here remember that short sales is endogenous as well. That is, there's an endogenous constraint on short selling, which is that you need some cash as collateral. That's the only constraint on short selling. Okay, so the rebate rates are here. So the rebates are again endogenous in the order of magnitude of 100 basis points for a disagreement of 10%, and so both short interest and rebate rates are increasing in the level of disagreement. So I know you've worked a lot on this, and also the spreads on bonds again are higher than the risk-free rate for two reasons now. The first one is this assignment mechanism that I had in a simple model that I talked about. And the second one is that, again, the lenders need to be convinced to not sell short. And so even on the AAA on the lowest leverage ratio loans, there is an excess premium, okay? And they can be substantial. Okay, so as a conclusion, so the data I've shown you on the leverage ratio distribution seem to lend support to this very simple model. That's a new static source of Pareto distributions in returns that doesn't have anything to do with Gibrat's law or random growth. There's new intuitions for financial prices and quantities. So as I said, returns on bonds, short selling costs are coming from disagreement and short interest. But there's a lot of potential for future work. Of course, empirical work on short interest rebate rates related to this disagreement, and also on financial regulation. Is it the case that we can really try to understand what's the belief of the marginal investor as a function of the Pareto coefficient of the leverage ratio distribution? Do you have any other question? Yes?
So you have the sharpest possible form of disagreement in this model.
Yeah.
This leads to the Pareto thing. Do you think that is robust? Do you think you need that kind of sharp disagreement to get the result? I mean, it makes sense to start with the sharpest possible disagreement.
Yeah.
I would want to see as a robustness, something less dramatic. Where you
That's a good question. So I could wave my hand and say yes, of course it will survive. But to be honest, I'm not sufficiently sure. This is an extremely stark model, and more work needs to be done to see whether it's robust or not.
Given your setup, is it practical to actually add that? Like either risk aversion or...
Yes, I think it's sufficiently simple. Well, there's already a lot to do with this very simple framework, but I think it's sufficiently simple that potentially you can add some other elements. I've not yet been able to do that. Otherwise, I would present it to you, but yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
So imagine I exogenously fix a distribution of the actual payoff, right?
Of the actual payoffs, yes.
So it's kind of completely disconnected from anything that's going on in the model. But I want to think about calibration of the exposed default rates and default distributions, right?
No, yeah.
And then I start shrinking the disagreement to kind of get your start result.
Yeah.
And you get closer and closer to the point that depending on the realization of the payoff, either everybody defaults or nobody defaults.
Yes.
Because the default decision is on, depending on the actual realization of the payoff, the default decision of everybody is on one side or the other side. Right. So, and I would like to think about like proper calibration of actual default rates and who defaults.
Yeah.
Then
So
I cannot really shrink the.
No. So that's a good question. So there's many responses. So the first one is that. So it depends on how you do it. So one way is to say people are right on average. So everyone is sure what's going to happen, but on average they're right. That is, this F distribution corresponds to the actual realized distribution of returns over time. That would be, I think, a natural assumption to make. So if you do that, you can compute those returns. The problem is that here I have just one asset. In practice, you have multiple assets. If you have multiple assets, the wealth that is going to end in this asset, the share of the wealth that ends in this asset matters a lot to know whether people are even optimistic on average. So here you have to take a stand. If it's housing, for example, you're going to see less default than if it's a very small asset, where basically people who are going to invest are going to be really very pessimistic, very optimistic about this asset. So it depends on many other things that I don't have in the model so far, so that I don't think I can do this exercise yet.
It's even in the quantitative application, one wouldn't necessarily want to shrink the distribution, right? Just explore.
No. Well, especially since.
And then how does the assignment work? So.
No, well, especially since the data on short interest is of the order of magnitudes of between 5 or 10%, something like that. And this points to a substantial amount of disagreement, actually. So it's not clear that you want disagreement to go to 0. It's not even clear. Okay. Well, thanks a lot.